Jim is the environmental attorney, and he's a professor in practice in environmental law at Rice University. He is also an author, an artist, a poet, a jack of all trades, but he's also an expert on the Texas Gulf Coast, and he's going to tell us a little bit today about an approach that will address a part of this problem in particular, which is the protection of the chemical and oil refineries along the Houston Ship Channel. Professor Blackburn, thank you.
Let's see if I can get this pulled up. Okay, well, thank you. It's very good to be here today, and what I want to talk about is really a different type of flooding. I mean, most of what Charles spoke about was rainfall-related flooding, and it's a huge issue in Harris County, but we've also got a coast. A lot of times we forget about it, that we have a coastal part of Harris County, and that we're extremely vulnerable to hurricane surge flooding. And so I really want to focus on that and about the protection, and to talk about some of the legal issues that are going to arise in trying to protect the coast and what those are. This is the map produced by Harris County Flood Control District. That's Hurricane Ike. As you can see, most of the hurricane surge from Ike went to the east of us. Basically, Ike missed Harris County. We're extremely fortunate. I'll show you some computer modeling in a second that will show what would have happened if Ike had gone in where it was supposed to have gone in, which is a bit different situation. But a couple of points to make. One, Ike did miss us. All of that surge went to the east. But now Ike was quote unquote only a Category 2 storm. But look at that surge flooding. It had a surge that would have been basically predicted to have been a Category 4 surge, but it was with a Cat 2 storm. After Ike, the National Weather Service has basically changed their classification or reporting procedures, and they now do both the categories of storms for wind speed purposes, but they have a second surge prediction. And that's because have had climate experts explain to me this is a result of climate change. Our storms are getting bigger. There's a greater breadth. And the wider the hurricane force wind field is, the more surge potential that you have. So we're basically seeing many different elements of a changing climate. And while I agree certainly with what Charles said, that historically we've had huge storms in the past, we're going to see a greater prevalence of big storms in the future, both rainfall storms and surge storms. That pattern is changing. Now, what we did is we took, at SPEED Center, we took Ike down to the worst point, which is this 0.7. Let's see if, I'm not going to touch that. 0.7 down at San Luis Pass. If Ike had come ashore there, we would have had significant flooding of the Houston Ship Channel. We'd had significant flooding of the Seabrook, Clear Lake area down into Galveston County. Probably would not have overtopped the Texas City levee system, which is at 17 feet, but it would have been extremely close. As it was with the back circulation, there was debris deposited on top of the Texas City levee. So we were that close to going over that levee there. So, what about a bigger storm? What about a large Cat 3, small Cat 4 storm coming in at 0.7? Well, I'll take you through. This is 24 hours prior to landfall. It's going to come in with that black line. 23 hours, 22 hours, 21, 20, 18, 19, 18. Now at this point you're about to lose connectivity up on the Bolivar Peninsula. Your marshes are all flooded pretty significantly, but you know, nothing really serious yet. 16 hours before, 15, 14. You can't get off of Bolivar anymore if you're cut off there. Probably cut off on the west end of Galveston, right there where the seawall stops with the black line. Where that black line stops, you really can't get across. I had a client that was basically on the west end of Galveston Island, was trying to get off about 10 or 11 o'clock the day that Ike was coming. His truck floated. He had a sick wife. He had the cat in a cat carrier, and he had all of his possessions in a truck, and it floated right off into the side of the road and down toward the bay. And they got out, and he had the cat carrier on top of his head, and basically felt very lucky to get off of Galveston Island alive. And that was basically about 18 hours before Ike hit, because there was a forerunner wave with Ike. So 13, 12, and you've got the color code over here on the side. That light blue is now 9, 10 feet above sea level. The darker blue, and you still really haven't seen bad flooding up into the bay yet. 8 hours before landfall, pretty much Bolivar's underwater, Galveston's underwater, except for a small amount behind the seawall. And you're beginning to now see the spread effects coming up into the area back behind San Leon down in Galveston County, coming up, and you'll see basically Taylor Lake connecting to the Bayport Channel fairly quickly. 7 hours prior to landfall, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, landfall. Now, at the coast, that is a 20-foot surge. Going up into the bay, we have not seen the worst of it up into the bay yet. And the chart seems to have gotten cut off a bit, but hopefully we'll refocus on that. But basically, Galveston, everything on the coast is underwater. Hour after landfall, we're beginning to move up into the bay now. 2 hours after landfall, Texas City levees beginning to be overtopped. You have got, look at that color, 22, 23 feet, Seabrook, Clear Lake, going up into the Houston Ship Channel. Most everything on the channel can survive 13, 14 feet of surge. It's done it in the past. Once we get to 15 feet, we're going to see significant flooding. 3 hours after landfall, it continues to get worse. 4, we're up to 25 feet in the Ship Channel. That's a large 3, small 4. Dorian was the largest 5 that we have seen in a long time. Irma and Maria were both Cat 5s. We are seeing a greater prevalence of large storms than we ever have, and this one isn't that big. 5 hours after landfall, 6 hours is probably the max in the upper area. Texas City is flooded behind the levee to about 10, 11 feet of flooding behind the levee system. The flooding goes all the way across. Interstate 45 is impenetrable or impassable in several places. And then it recedes. That's what you're looking at. A large Cat 3, small 4, and you have basically flooded everything pretty much from the NASA area, Bayport, all the way up through the Ship Channel, Texas City. Our industrial complex is totally inundated. That complex, with 25 feet of water, basically every facility is flooded to some extent. We have done an inventory of tanks on the Ship Channel. There's 4,400 tanks on the channel that we counted. We've got LIDAR data for every one of them. Of that, an estimate by Jamie Padgett, about 2,200 of those will be flooded to some extent. Dr. Rafai is here as well. She's also done studies about the impacts of this flooding on industrial base. Another slide from Jamie basically showing in the color code the tank areas where she's expecting major problems. The red tanks have a 1% chance of failure. Across 2,200 tanks, if you have the failure of 10 tanks, 11 tanks, you could be talking about significant amounts of oil and hazardous substances. I'm going to skip that. That basically translates that surge flooding into the population base. There's roughly, I won't say totally, there's approximately 800,000 people in the cities that are exposed to some significant flooding, plus the industrial base. So we're talking about the industrial base of the Houston region, plus about 800,000 people that are exposed to some extent or another to this storm. This is the spill volumes that Jamie calculated coming out of these different scenarios. And with about 24 feet of surge, she's estimated about 92 million gallons of oil and hazardous substances would be released. Now, to put that in perspective, Exxon Valdez was 10 to 12 million gallons that were spilled. Deepwater Horizon was about 200 million gallons. So this would be about half, a little bit less than half of Deepwater Horizon at 24 feet of surge. At 26 feet of surge, it's well over 50% of it. And it's all going into the communities adjacent to the ship channel first, and then back into Galveston Bay, which is a confined bay system. It's not in the open Gulf. It's not in the Gulf of Alaska. It's in Galveston Bay. As far as I'm concerned, there's no way Galveston Bay is going to survive this as a viable ecological system in the long term. This is from Dorian. This just shows you the type of spill that you can have with a rupture of a tank. There was also oil that was on the water here at this particular location. I have not seen a follow-up report on this to determine how bad it was. The Galveston Corps of Engineers, following up on work that Bill Merrill did down at Texas A&M Galveston, has come up with a coastal barrier concept that will be essentially that they have proposed to address hurricane surge flooding. This is a first line of defense. It is basically the existing Galveston seawall is shown in the yellow line on the Gulf side of Galveston. In blue is a 2-mile long gauge structure that goes across basically where the ferry runs between Galveston Island and Bolivar. The depth there varies between 30 and 60 feet, and it's a 2-mile area. It will be probably the largest engineered flood control structure in the world, most likely, as a single structure. And I'll show you a little bit more about it in a minute. But it has navigation gates. It also has circulation gates that have been proposed for the to basically allow the tide in and out of Galveston Bay. You simply cannot block off. In the Netherlands, they blocked off the Zuider Zee on the north side of Amsterdam, and they turned it into a freshwater lagoon. We do not want Galveston Bay turned into a freshwater lagoon. That will basically kill its ecological productivity. Galveston Bay is the second most productive estuary in the United States. So for that reason, circulation becomes a key issue, and certainly that pass controls circulation in East Bay, West Bay, Galveston Bay, Trinity Bay. So it is the central most important feature in the bay from circulation. It also is where most of the surge water comes in. So it's a perfect place to block if you can do it and not have a major incident or basically kill the bay in the process. The green lines were originally proposed as 17-foot hard levees, either located somewhere either in front of the beach houses, elevated roads, or behind the roads. The Corps of Engineers had some very, very unpleasant public meetings in Bolivar, the west end of Galveston, and they have changed that part of the plan. They are now going with basically a sand dune field that would be to 8 to 12 feet of elevation rather than a 17-foot hard levee, which means that more water will be getting into the bay than they had originally projected because you just simply don't stop as much water with a 12-foot sand dune system as you do with a 17-foot hard levee. Importantly, that 17-foot levee was not to protect Bolivar or the west end of Galveston. It was basically to keep water out of the bay. So it was really part of a bay-wide protection system, and I think the people at Bolivar and west end of Galveston kind of rightly figured out it really wasn't helping them a lot, and what they really wanted were dunes. So that seems to be where we're headed with that. Up on the top, which includes Harris County, a couple of important things. It's a little hard to see, and I'm not sure. That didn't work. I knew I shouldn't have done that. I'm going to walk over to this big map and point out two things. There's a blue here, and there's a blue up there at Clear Lake. Those are gate structures that are proposed by the Corps to keep surge from going up Dickinson Bayou and going up Clear Lake. Those gate structures have the potential to obstruct rainfall runoff coming back. So they have huge pumping systems associated with them. Each of those cost $1 billion each. So that's $2 billion worth of investment there. The coastal spine itself is 12 to 20 billion, plus there's some other work down the coast. The crosshatched is non-structural solutions. Non-structural solutions are basically elevation, possibly land use regulation, possibly buyout, depending, but also flood proofing. And in the Corps presentation at the SSPEED Center conference yesterday, they basically said they were emphasizing elevation and flood proofing. But basically that area is not protected by the coastal spine because there's enough water in Galveston Bay to generate about certainly a 15 to 20 foot surge on the west side of Galveston Bay just by essentially the sloshing effect of the water internal to the bay system. That's how come the Corps has put that defense system, if you will, in the upper part of the bay away from the coast. That's what's called the Okeechobee effect. Lake Okeechobee is a totally inland lake, and there was a 15-foot surge that was generated by a hurricane that passed over it and killed 2,000 people surrounding Lake Okeechobee back in the 30s. So that is what the concern is that even with the barrier to shut off the surge coming into the bay to some extent, we have enough water in the bay to cause a major flood issue. With the coastal spine in place, west side industry is still extremely vulnerable. On the left-hand side shows basically a interpretation of what a 20-foot surge would do to the west side of Galveston Bay. And I put over on the right-hand side the Bayport Industrial Complex. I went out and made this presentation at NASA, and NASA was, one, concerned about their potential vulnerability to flooding, but more importantly, they were very concerned about the vulnerability of ruptured tanks from the Bayport area causing leakage that would be carried further to the west with the surge into the NASA area. The elevations are hard to read, and I don't have my glasses on, but I believe that this is 6 feet of inundation. This is basically taking LiDAR imagery, looking at the land elevation, and then putting the 20-foot surge on top of it, and what's being reported is the differential. I'm sorry, that's LiDAR elevation. That's 6 feet of elevation on the north side of Bayport there. You're up to about 8 to 10 feet of elevation as you move into the orange and red, up to basically 20 feet at the white. So most everything you see in red in this diagram would be flooded even if the coastal barrier were in place. It's pretty spooky. We have not analyzed the tanks in this area for the amount of material that would be released. We just focused on the ship channel. Again, just a close-up of that. A close-up of that industrial complex. I think this is the most vulnerable industrial complex we have, which is the Bayport Industrial Complex between Red Bluff and basically 146. Particularly the lower end of that coming up off of Taylor Lake is extremely vulnerable there. So, from a legal standpoint, what laws apply to trying to build something like this? Corps of Engineers has put out a draft integrated feasibility report and environmental impact statement. So that's the National Environmental Policy Act, federal act. NEPA requires that for any action like this, an environmental full disclosure document must be prepared. It's a two-step process. A draft environmental impact statement is produced. That draft goes out for public comments. There is a public review of that document. There's hearings. This is where the Corps kind of got an earful about what they were doing down on the coast. There were multiple of these meetings that were held around the bay system. I think that was probably about a year ago, if I'm not mistaken. And as a result of that, frankly, the Corps of Engineers has made an unprecedented move, and my hat's off to them. They basically are going back and redesigning. So they, for the first time in my memory, I've basically for 40 years have litigated the Corps of Engineers on the Texas coast. For the first time in my memory, they actually have listened to the public and have gone back and are trying to make adaptations to make this project more acceptable to the public. So like I said, my hat's off to them. I've also made public presentations where the public wasn't real thrilled with what they heard. It is hard to time after time go to the public, show them things and hear what a bunch of idiots you are. And you know, because people get angry. People get nasty. I mean, I have arrows all over my body from an earlier project called the Centennial Gate that was not liked a lot in the Bay Area. This is the gate structure they're talking about, something like that. This is the Maesland Barrier in the Netherlands. People come from all over Europe to watch them open and close these to see. I mean, they do it about once or twice a year, and literally it is a tourist attraction to just watch them see if they work. They're huge. The navigation channel is probably 60 feet deep there. Their surge is not nearly as high off the North Sea as we get in the Gulf of Mexico. But those barriers, I mean, that's an 80-foot high structure when it's sitting on the land. And then you basically bring it across and then sink it. And I mean, it's huge. Trust me on that. That's the largest, currently the largest barrier in the world. This is in the Eastern Scheldt in the Netherlands. These are the circulation gates that they built in the Eastern Scheldt after having basically killed the Zuider Zee north of Amsterdam. This was built in the 60s and 70s after a huge storm in the 50s. And this is a massive structure in itself. In this case, they have a road across the top of it. Because again, where they're building this, the height of the surge they're concerned about isn't as big of a factor. But those are all lift gates. They shut when the storm's coming, but otherwise they stay open to provide circulation. The Eastern Scheldt has had significant negative environmental impacts from this, and this is, again, was intended to try to address that. It just hasn't necessarily been successful. Now the Corps has announced, because they're restudying, and they also are proposing a backside levee around Galveston. Let me go back. In red, you see a backside levee just kind of drawn on the map. Galveston's not sure they want a backside levee, so that's another earful that the Corps of Engineers has gotten. I think the Corps is a little tired of public meetings right now. But so they've got basically a redesign coming of their levee system along Bolivar and along Galveston Island. They have a redesign of the gate system, because the gate system that they put together, which was a combination of these two across a 2-mile stretch, that had a significant restriction in circulation on Galveston Bay. So the Corps went out and has asked basically designers from all over the world to come in and try to come up with a much less flow impeding alternative than what they had come up with so far. And they announced yesterday that they have now gotten the impedance down to less than 10% with a new design, but they have not done the engineering work on it for detailed design, and they haven't done the dollar costing. Plus now with the red line, Galveston's not sure they want a backside levee, and there's all sorts of questions about where that levee should be located. So the point being, there's a lot of uncertainty about this proposal. So the Corps is now proposing to prepare something that I've never seen in the Galveston district and probably have never seen in Texas, which is a tiered environmental impact statement. Basically, they will be doing separate supplemental environmental impacts statements on each of the individual projects as they think they're ready to be spun off and sent out. So this will now be morphed into probably 3 separate projects, one of which will be the sand dune barrier piece, one of which will be the Galveston Island backside levee piece, and one of which will be the big navigation gate, and actually the 4th one would be up in the Bay Area with the Dickinson and with the Clear Lake gate structures, and then otherwise with the non-structural. And actually there's a 5th part I may mention at the end, which is a whole set of environmental enhancements going down the coast, and that will probably be yet another spun-off alternative. The point being, it's not going to be business as usual with the Corps. And again, I tip my hat to them. They are responding to a situation. They're trying to come up with new ways of thinking, doing, ways we've never done here before. So from that standpoint, it's something to keep your eyes on, because it's going to probably be confusing to a lot of people that think they understand the National Environmental Policy Act. There's going to be a lot of lawyers doing research on tiered environmental impact statements, I have no doubt. But it all goes back to the original oil leasing back during the 70s when NEPA was a new law. NEPA was passed in 1969, became effective January 1st, 1970. And oil leasing was challenged in the 70s, and they basically did an impact statement at the national level, said it made sense to lease. They did 5 regional impact statements about the environmental attributes of the Gulf, Pacific, Atlantic, I think it was Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea. And then each individual lease would be a drop-down project under those tiered systems. That was the original tiered EIS. It appears that transportation projects have done much more tiering that have other types of federal actions. And like I said, as far as I know, the Corps may have had tiering. It would make some sense, for example, in permitting situations if they were trying to be proactive and were expecting a lot of permitting action in a particular environmental region. But I don't think the Galveston District has ever done a tiered environmental impact statement before. So, what else do they have to deal with? Well, they have the Endangered Species Act. We have designated critical habitat for the Pite plover on the islands. The Kemp's Ridley sea turtle nests along the Galveston Island and along Bolivar. Now, Kemp's Ridley is much more prevalent as you go further south, but you still have areas that are known as nesting sites in our part of the world. If you were to perhaps put a hard barrier along the barrier island, you would probably have issues with both of these species. With sand dunes, probably much less of an issue. And that brings us to an alternative called the Galveston Bay Park Plan. And the Galveston Bay Park Plan is something that we created at SSPEED Center. The idea was basically to put a barrier that would protect the upper part of Galveston Bay. What you see here is a barrier that on the bottom connects to the Texas City levee system, comes up, runs along the west side of the ship channel, right across from San Leon. It flips over to the east side and goes north and ultimately connects up to Houston Point in Chambers County. The idea was initially to just put a barrier along the edge of the ship channel. We would use dredge material from the ship channel to construct, and it was a kind of a line on a map type of thing. And then a landscape architect, urban planner architect named Rob Rogers got hold of it and turned it into the Galveston Bay Park Plan. And it's amazing what someone like an architect, urban planner can do to a couple of lines on a map to make them really come alive and become really something very, very different and potentially very special. His idea was, in addition to having beneficial uses from an environmental standpoint, to turn basically the dredge disposal area of Galveston Bay into public space. This is what's shown here is 10,000 acres of park space that would be accessible from both the north and from the south end, and would essentially open up Galveston Bay in ways that I'll talk about a little bit. The elements that we proposed, one was to put the barrier into the bay along the ship channel using dredge material. Two, we're going to have to raise the Texas City levee. We think Texas City levee is too low. Our proposal is to elevate along the Houston ship channel to 25 feet. 25 feet would protect against the surge that I showed you. Texas City levee is about 17 feet. So it'll have to be increased in height. With three, we also think a backside levee is necessary in Galveston. Galveston's extremely vulnerable from the backside. Frankly, we think that seawall's too low. 17 feet really doesn't protect Galveston. They probably need more like 20, 21. And we had proposed elevating 3005 and Highway 87 for evacuation and sand nourishment for the beach. It appears sand nourishment's coming. And the Galveston levee could go over to protect Pelican Island if that was necessary and if the coastal gate structure were not being constructed. So this is what we're talking about, making these connections. We're talking about using dredge material from the ship channel to build this. Now, when we proposed this, we had no idea that the oil industry was very serious about widening the Houston ship channel. And in this last legislative session, the Port of Houston got an earful from the oil and gas industry about the need to widen the Houston ship channel. The port has what's called Project 11 to widen the channel now from 530 feet to 700 feet. All of that dredge material is already spoken for with a lot of beneficial use projects. What we're proposing is to further widen the ship channel from 700 to 900 feet, which is the width that the pilots want for safety and navigation, and using the virgin clay material that would be taken up to be the construction material for the Galveston Bay Park Plan. So it's a combined dredging proposal and park plan proposal, essentially taking the virgin clay material, it's not contaminated, it's suitable for construction, and using that to build the 25-foot levee. Currently, the port puts 25-foot basically berms along the ship channel. They're just not built to legal specifications for levees, but that technology is proven. There would be one navigation gate at the place where basically the sides are flipped, and there would be several small navigation gates, and that comes out of New Orleans. We'd probably use lift gates more like what is down at Texas City Levee to allow small craft navigation and circulation east-west, and there's currently about 5 of those. That may increase based on the results of computer modeling. The dredge material would go behind. This would essentially provide disposal capacity probably for the next 50 years for the Houston ship channel for maintenance dredging purposes, and would be converted into, at the least, wetland areas with beneficial use of dredge material, which is currently ongoing at the ship channel. So you'd have that basically structure, and to that you would have that type of flood protection from that 25-foot surge we were saying, and that basically provides significant protection to the backside of Galveston Bay. There's still some residual surge coming up the Dickinson Bayou, not as much up Clear Lake. And basically in here what we're showing is Galveston Bay is a hard edge right now. Everything along the west shoreline of Galveston Bay is a hard edge. We have eliminated our wetlands. They don't exist anymore really along the west edge. So we would be providing soft edge on the backside of that, which would be significant improvement from a habitat standpoint. That's what some of the beneficial use out on the ship channel looks like right now. That's what it looks like from some of the disposal areas looking back across. And then to that, what Rob wants to do is add recreation. And what could you do? There's not a Redfish Island's essentially gone. There's no sailing destination in Galveston Bay at the current time. And basically Houston would become a seaport city. And this would be a landmark. So, what permits are needed? Because we're not going to build this as a federal project. Federal project's down on the coast. This is proposed to be built as a permitted facility. Permits are required under Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act, Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, applies. So a full environmental impact statement will need to be done for this work. Section 404 also basically requires the least damaging alternative to be selected. So there's something called the 404B1 guidelines that EPA put out many years ago. These are among the most stringent environmental guidelines that we have. So this will be subjected to some very rigorous environmental review. Now here's an interesting one. How many of you have ever heard of Section 408 permit review? Section 408 says if you're going to do something on federal property, you have to, again, get the approval of the Corps of Engineers. So certainly to raise the Texas City levee to 17 feet, although that doesn't involve any discharge into the water, the Corps will have to approve that. But the one and I've met with the Corps several times just talking about this and trying to work through these issues, the one that has got them really flabbergasted is allowing people onto dredge disposal areas. They have never allowed the public to utilize dredge disposal areas. And that again is going to require 408 permitting. And so this sort of, basically what we're talking about is a plan that raises issues and ideas that are new and different. And frankly, I think are quite creative, but it's going to cause some new problems. It's a different type of thing. That's, by the way, the lifts. That's the gate to allow people in and out of the behind the Texas City levee system. Circulation. A lot of people are concerned that this will cut off circulation into certainly the Galveston Bay portion. Now, it does not interfere with anything really up into Trinity Bay, East or West Bay. The real issue is circulation into and out of the what you call the confined area here. And then secondly, can the floodwaters get out? So you've got two issues there. We've done computer modeling, very preliminary, at SSPEED Center that indicates from a circulation standpoint, it really doesn't appear to be a major issue. Salinity fluctuation is less than a part per thousand. Galveston Bay in this part is usually 10 to 20 parts per thousand. A part per thousand fluctuation probably is within an acceptable range, but that can probably be made better with another circulation channel. In terms of evacuation of the water, more detailed modeling needs to be done, but from a preliminary standpoint, using this as a goal, I think the recommendation will be to add one more circulation channel opening east-west to try to make sure we can move all of the water out. But it doesn't, again, appear to be a major problem. For the most part, your timing on stormwater runoff's going to be 24 hours after the storm comes through, because you've got to bring it down the San Jacinto watershed. You've got to bring it down the Buffalo Bayou watershed. You do get help from Addicks and Barker that would hold back the water from the far west. And then you've got the Trinity River coming in usually 2 to 3 days later. So timing is everything here. And so we'll see how all of that works out. There is a lot more modeling to be done, but preliminary results look reasonable. Oysters, big issue. Impacting oysters. There will be oyster impacts. There is no question. I think that can be mitigated to a large extent, but there is physical space that the oysters occupy. The oysters have actually liked the ship channel. They like the edge of the channel. So just the widening of the channel itself that's already proposed under Project 11 will probably take a lot of the oysters on the west side. They will not have been, they won't have moved back in by the time that we would come in to go from 700 feet to 900 feet if there is at least synchronicity here. But the point being, there's going to need to be a lot of oyster mitigation. Oyster, it turns out, can be mitigated. They can be mitigated successfully. And I put that blue arrow in, and I think I've got this. Galveston Bay is going to change in the future. And this is what I think environmental impact review at its best can really do well. We're going to be taking more and more water for the city of Houston, for North Harris County, out of the Trinity River. We're going to be diverting water back over to the San Jacinto Riverside and away from the Trinity Riverside. And that is essentially the long-term plan for the city of Houston. And what we anticipate is that the sweet spot for oysters without our project, just by what is set in motion, the sweet spot for oysters will be migrating north into Trinity Bay. We have, I think, the ability with the mitigation plan to anticipate that migration and to basically work with it to, frankly, keep the oyster population in Galveston Bay viable. This is, again, subject to computer modeling. We need to look at the timing, but certainly when you start drawing down Lake Livingston significantly, you will reduce freshwater inflow into Galveston Bay, and this has come out of a lot of the Senate Bill 3 work on the bay and estuaries that have been ongoing. So there's some very interesting issues that are in front of us in terms of reviewing. Now, I thought I'd just throw a few other things out. Timing-wise, we have another 10 minutes or so. If you think about hurricane surge flooding, no protection, and these spills we're talking about take place, there is huge liability potential. Now, we've had some difficulty getting industry to talk much with us publicly about these issues. I think part of it is that there's worry about liability. And certainly you start talking anything beyond a 15-foot surge and there will be liability. Now, when I've talked to the industry, they've said we've never seen a surge beyond 15 feet. They're correct. There is nothing on the record that shows up the Houston Ship Channel. Now, there was no Houston Ship Channel monitor with the 1900 Galveston storm. That's the one that there would have been a big surge on. And we don't really have a good record. We think it was 20 feet in Galveston. 20 feet in Galveston would generate about 25 feet up in the upper part of Galveston Bay because there's a funneling effect that comes with these storms. But we don't know it. But oil, hazardous substances, strict liability for oil spills. There's damage for the cleanup, remedial action. There is dollar damages for damages to the natural system. There is not personal injury damages that are available, nor are there homeowner damages that are available. That is going to be handled under common law, not under statutory law. But Section 311 and the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 is where your liability for oil comes. Section 311 is strict liability for spills of hazardous substances. And then CERCLA, there's strict liability for releases. I think that there will be significant liability in the case of a major storm coming like what we're talking about. Probably to the point that, well, let's put it this way. I think the insurance industry that's offering reinsurance, most ship channel industries are self-insured to about $300 million. There's reinsurance, Swiss Re, Lloyd's, beyond that. I think they're going to be very interested to see some sort of protection and will be much more willing to talk about it. Now, something to keep in mind, containers are really one of the things I'm really worried about with surge flooding. I want to emphasize something I really didn't emphasize earlier. Surge flooding is violent, very, very violent. We're talking about wind-driven water with waves on top of it. Now, when I give you these elevations, I've been pretty sure that what we're projecting is just the water surface without the waves. So the waves would be on top of it. But basically, these waves are pounding and pounding and pounding. And they'll pick up containers and move them. Now, this is from the Bahamas. And basically, I think you can see a container. Well, everything's elongated. That blue thing that's elongated is a container. I think the red is a container that have just been picked up and tossed into this debris. I had a friend during Ike who lived in Shore Acres, and she had essentially a container that came into her kitchen from Galveston Bay. These things are like moving battering rams. If you put one of these into the side of a tank that's storing hazardous materials or oil, it's just going to pop it like it wasn't there. Even the wood might break it. And basically the leakage we're talking about is really from flotation. We're not even talking about debris battering because I don't think anyone can quite model that. But look at the container storage that we have around the bay. How well do you think those containers are basically secured? They're not. You put 5-10 feet of water around those containers and they're going to float off. And they're going to turn into battering rams all over that. And so we've got Bayport over there on the right, and you've got that container tank. I mean, you've got that tank for them right there. That is a huge tank, a huge export area. It's a worry. Now, defenses, act of God. You know, this is where climate change comes in. This is where what Charles was talking about comes in. On the one hand, there has been a lot of looking in the past. I mean, in the past, we've known we've had big storms. But we also know climate change is changing our storms. I think with flooding, we're about to see the act of God defense totally disappear. All of this is, frankly, foreseeable. We're talking about 25 feet of surge with a small Category 4 storm, high Cat 3. That's nothing. Not like those storms we've been through. Dorian sitting on the Bahamas. If you had Dorian sitting on top of Galveston Bay for that length of time, my goodness. So this is foreseeable. We've got things there. So I would tell you that, at least from my perspective, there is no longer really an act of God defense with regard to rainfall flooding and surge flooding. There may be other elements. The extent of the liabilities, recovery costs, damages to natural resources, damages to individuals, contractors, they don't fit into that. That's all going to be personal injury. The big precedent on that we have for these types of spills, this is Murphy Oil. This is a tank that is a 250,000 barrel tank, huge tank. And it was floated by floodwaters during Katrina. It just literally lifted off of its foundation and moved about, I don't know, what did it say? How far did it move? That's still a 250,000 barrel tank. It was floated and moved 33 feet to the east and 4 feet to the north. And it had about a quarter of its contents inside. And you can see on the images the sheen. That's the neighborhoods that were affected. I think Murphy ended up buying about 300 houses. There were about 1,000 houses that were impacted, and there was a significant settlement that was basically negotiated. So what would you sue for? Negligence. For failure to protect. What's your criteria? Reasonable care and foreseeability. Clearly, these storms are foreseeable. It's a jury issue. I'm sure there'll be experts that'll say, oh my gosh, no, who could have guessed? And what you're going to hear a lot about is a 100-year flood, which most everybody I know just chuckles when we say a 100-year flood. Because we've not only seen 100-year, we've seen 500-year. I looked up under the statistics to figure out what Harvey was by those metrics, and it's a 40,000-year storm by those metrics. And then we had Imelda 2 years later that kind of replicated it. I mean, these statistics are just flat out of date. And everything we're building by these current statistics is wrong. It's in error. So how about engineering malpractice? Where does that fit on the scale of things? What is reasonable care for an engineer? Well, I built to the 100-year flood. I looked at the map. I did what a good engineer does. I looked at the map, saw a 100-year floodplain line. That's what I used. I don't think that that is going to work anymore. But we haven't talked about it. We don't discuss these things publicly. We don't talk about what is a reasonable level of care. And again, just putting these images in front of you. What should reasonable care be for an industry? Well, one, make sure your tanks don't float. We know that these tanks can float. Can they be tied down better? Can they be secured better? You bet they can. How about a better barrier? Right now, the barriers that we have are primarily to contain oil from spills internal. So we basically are protecting the spill from getting out of the facility. We're not protecting the facilities from floodwaters coming in. Our floodplain maps are very, very poorly done. I would tell you that surge flooding is probably the worst mapped area. We don't carry the surge nearly far enough inland. Much of the area I showed you that would be subject to the various surge flooding, by the way, under current statistics, which I think are outdated, the storm I've been showing you is basically FEMA Storm 36, which is a 250-year frequency storm. I would tell you that if those statistics were updated, it would likely be less than a 100-year storm. So we're looking at essentially this type of coverage. Should every industry be building berms to 25 feet? There are those that have suggested that would be better than building something in the bay to protect the community. Just require every industry to put a 25-foot berm around themselves. Well, those berms are hard to build. I will just tell you this. I have looked at it, trying to find all the pipelines, trying to understand all of the connections. It's tricky, but something to think about. I personally think that that is not the best way because it doesn't protect the public as well. And again, unless there were a regulation that was applicable to everyone, while an industry or two might do it, many will choose not to do it. How about evacuation of tanks? Should we pump out every tank before the storm comes in? Or should we fill them all up to make sure they don't float? Or what do they do? Anybody know? I would tell you they're probably, the policies vary from company to company. And each, some go up, some go down, some do nothing. We ought to be talking about these things. And how about this? Now this is the one that just kind of drives me crazy. We've got a national defense freeway system that doesn't work. We have, how many times have we seen the freeway shut down? Once a year at least. I mean, and this, on one, how'd that barge get, how did we allow that barge to be moored in the San Jacinto River up above the I-10 bridge? Well, it turns out that was an unregulated activity. Now, I haven't seen, I don't know, has anybody seen a lawsuit filed on this yet? It'll be interesting. That's private sector action affecting a freeway. Interesting. How about these freeways? Impassable. I think I saw with Imelda at least 3 freeways that were shut down. And I don't think 288 was shut down at Brays Bayou on this one, but usually 288 gets shut down at Brays Bayou. I know going north out of downtown, we usually shut down 45, and certainly at White Oak Bayou and I-10, we shut that down. Is there legal action that could be brought here? What responsibility does the federal highway system have to basically update the rainfall that they're planning for? I would say there's a duty to supplement environmental impact statements, and I think there's probably at least a way to make them study it. I'm not sure you can make them do anything about it, unless there's substance under the National Defense Highway Act. But it's hard to find national defense when you can't drive around during a flood. I put this chart up. Charles mentioned NOAA Atlas 14. This is the revised 100-year rainfall map. We are raising our 100-year rain in Houston from 33 feet, from 13 inches in 24 hours to about 17 to 18 inches in 24 hours. That pink area, that bright pink, is 17 inches. The lighter pink is 18 inches, gradating over to about 16 inches on the far west side. This is out of date already, in my opinion. But this is what we're going to be using for our next round of floodplain maps. It won't be coming out until I think I heard yesterday 2022, 2023 time period. But this is only current through 2017. And it is weighted with a lot of statistics from the 50s and 60s and 70s still. If one takes a look at the recent trends and projects the 100-year from that, you would get a significantly higher 100-year rain than 17 inches in 24 hours. Catherine Hayhoe, which is my favorite climate scientist, talks about we are basically planning using our rear view mirrors. We are looking backwards, not forwards. Now, I can tell you, if we use 17 inches as our 100-year rainfall, those maps will be obsolete the second they're issued. They're obsolete, in my opinion, right now, and they don't even exist yet. Now, Larry Dunbar at the SPEED conference said he thinks that the 100-year level is 30 inches in 24 hours. He's probably not far off. That is a large, large number. But the point being, we've got a flooding issue that is gargantuan, and we have not admitted that yet. It's a gargantuan from a surge standpoint. If the surge I'm talking about hits, you can just forget about the Houston economy in the future. You can forget about Galveston Bay. We've got to talk about climate change. I know it's hard. I'll tell you, after Harvey, I was, Phil Beatty and I from the SPEED Center at Rice were ended up being quoted a lot on the media. And I had several people write me and say, Blackburn, you're doing great. Don't talk about climate change. You'll destroy your credibility. Climate change is happening. And if we don't talk honestly about it, we're never going to get to the root of these issues. So, with that, I'll be happy to take any questions. And, you know, it's sobering between what Charles covered and I think what I'm covering here. Those are sobering topics, but they're really important to the future of this region, and I think we've got to deal with them.
Does anybody have any questions for Professor?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, what is the time frame on the coastal spine?
Time frame on the coastal spine was going to be 2035 before they went back for the reconsiderations. I have not seen a revised time frame. What they were saying yesterday was that they hope to get the, I think, revised draft impact statement out, at least the first of those out, about a year from now. So that means that I would say they're probably looking at a 2 to 3 year delay from 2035 just because of the processing of just because of the additional time. If you just added in the additional legal time they're going to require, it'll be at least, I would think, 2 years more. And then that doesn't say how hard it is to construct this new concept of the barrier they're coming up with. The sand dunes, those can be done much more quickly. The Galveston backside levee can be done much more quickly. It is hard to build that barrier across Bolivar roads quickly at all. I mean, that is a massive engineering project. And like I say, it will probably be the largest engineering project in the world, period. So it's huge. Other questions? Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, I like this idea about the Galveston Bay Park plan, but you talked about using dredge material, and I didn't hear any concern about like chemical contamination of that material.
Sure, it's an issue. What we're talking about, virgin clay, there's a lot of bay bottom that has been covered with fine sediment, and it's the fine sediment where the majority of the contamination will be. And it's the clay that has been pretty much unaffected on the bottom of the bay. That's good clean material. The trick is getting to it. And so the fluff, if you will, needs to be taken off and addressed separately. There will probably be some mixed materials in there. The extent of contamination has to be tested, has to be determined. From a recreational standpoint, where you saw sand perhaps on the backside, that would be brought in and that would be placed on top of anything else. And I mean, it could be contaminated with the fluff, but not the virgin clay material. So we're going to spend a lot of time trying to separate those things out, and that's one of the tasks for the engineers in the next phase. Yes?
You got what's in widening is currently, like you said, the widening of the ship channel is going from 530 to about 700 feet. Also doing a huge promotion to expand current petrochemical and refining facilities. If there is a push to extend that further from 700 to 900 feet, would you propose or would you comment on any concerns over also expanding the petrochemical and refining facilities?
Well, I
that
think,
would be part
well,
of the problem.
for start, I mean, I hear what you're saying, I mean, and it's a dilemma I know that many of us, are concerned about. I would tell you that expansion is coming. And the ship channel can accommodate the expansion with 700 feet of width. So I would say it's the widening from 530 to 700 that is the critical piece in terms of what the petroleum industry sort of absolutely says they have to have. That's being done as a federal project and as a port project. What we're talking about is basically adding more safety into that increased use. And so it's really a safety move. It's something the pilots want. Also, the container traffic has been affected by the petroleum traffic. And the port was shutting down the ship channel to bring in huge post-Panamax. The Panama Canal was recently widened. There's bigger container ships that the port wants to service, but they had to shut down the ship channel to bring them in because they could not accommodate two-way traffic. That's what precipitated the big argument at the legislature. And basically, the port can't bring in, it's basically now not bringing in the big container ships to accommodate the oil industry in the short term until the widening comes along. So those types of things are affecting the operation of the port. I think it's affecting safety. And I've always been concerned about the widening and deepening of the channel. But I think in this case, the widening is necessary for safety. But more so, we need the dredge material to build the protection. And if we don't get the protection, I'm afraid that we're going to lose the entire basis.
I guess I should have rephrased my question. My question is more with a widening of the ship channel and the potential promotion of having more increased exports and imports, creating more petrochemical facility activities, that would be more activity at the fence line or potentially create more fence line, frontline environmental justice communities.
I mean, that is absolutely, I think, a correct concern. I don't think that the shipping is the limiting factor on that. I mean, I think that those permits are going to be applied for regardless. I think the real issue is I think the plastics industry particularly is overbuilt. Most of the export that we're talking about is really pumping through Kinder Morgan and Enterprise, basically pump stations. And I don't think those will cause an increase in adjacent facilities. The plastics expansion is what I have been particularly concerned about, and I don't know of a refinery expansion proposed on the ship channel. I may be wrong, but I haven't heard of that. It's mainly been plastics plants, and I just think that's going to be a market cure, but they can be permitted. I mean, this isn't export of plastics. So, I mean, from the widening and deepening standpoint, is to get the raw oil basically out of the tank farms and into the channel and going overseas. And I mean, there's an argument from a climate standpoint that we ought not to be doing it, but that's an argument that, frankly, Texas is going to do it, and I'm afraid that that's going to happen. But I don't think that will generate the fence line impacts that you're concerned about. I think it's really the plastics expansion that would be the most worrisome, and that's a whole different market and a whole different issue.
Okay. Thank you, Professor
Thank you, Rob.
Blackburn. Thank you very much.